Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the French Revolution Part 1 by Oversimplified. You know, we've been doing these oversimplified reactions lately. I thought this would be a good one to jump into. A fascinating topic, and certainly a big one to cover. Now, if you'd have liked to have seen this video early, or get early access to Part 2, then you can become a YouTube channel member. You can do that by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button. Right, joining, you'll get to see a bunch of exclusive videos and get these oversimplified videos early. And if you're watching as a channel member, thank you so much for all of the support. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
This video was made possible by NordVPN. Get protected by clicking the link below and get an amazing 75% off. That's only $2.99 per month with an additional month free for a limited time. Also, new French Revolution merch available now in the store, including King Louis and Marie Antoinette character pins, complete with detachable heads, just like the real thing. So I said to the Marquis de la Fufayette, "What do you think I am? Some dirty peasant? I've never worked a day in my life." Wow, that Marie Antoinette sure is pretty. Sure is. Wouldn't want to be Prince Louis though. That's going to be a lot of responsibility when he becomes king, especially since France is in financial ruin. Quite. Thank you one and all for attending the royal marriage of my grandson, the future King of France, to the Archduchess of Austria. Now for the very awkward yet historically accurate part of the ceremony, where we all watch them get into bed together.
Ooh. They had some pretty odd practices, especially among the aristocratic circles of France. They had some strange stuff going on at Versailles.
All right, now that's out of the way, let's leave the royal couple to it. You better give us an heir, you fat, ill-bred boy. Nighty-night.
Damn.
That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. You fat, ill-bred boy. Quite. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. You fat, ill-bred boy. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. Oh, great. He's a frickin' weirdo. France, the most prosperous, cultured, and beautiful nation in the world, as it had been for centuries. An exquisite social culture, with the king and the upper classes throwing crazy parties every night, enjoying high living and fine dining.
Yeah, you know, France was really the continental power of Europe. Of course, they had this rivalry with Britain, but France was very powerful, very wealthy, very influential. The aristocracy were very rich, and they were doing whatever they wanted, and their culture spread throughout Europe, right? The lingua franca, the reason it's called a lingua franca of that time was French. Right? That was the language of the aristocracies of Europe. So France was very influential, very powerful.
Who cares that they were only able to do so off the backs of the hardworking, starving poor? What are they gonna do? Revolt? They're only 80% of the population.
Right.
No. Life in France is great. What's that, France? You want to go to war with Britain and increase your power? Go for it, little buddy. You do you. And you lost. Now you're in severe financial debt. We have no money.
I mean, this is when that rivalry with Britain was really becoming more and more serious. The 7 Years' War, where the United Kingdom sort of beats France's ass. It loses a lot of its colonial empire, and a trend that will sort of continue. Britain gains more and more territory in North America. France is broke and struggling.
What do we do? Should we stop partying? Heck no. Party harder. That's okay. The peasantry will pick up the slack. They were created by God to do all the work, and you were created to reap all the benefits and party hard. That's just how society works, and we've all just accepted it for centuries. Why? Why what? Why do the nobility get to be all rich and stuff? Just because they were born into it? And the rest of us schmucks just have to accept that? Hell, why do we even need a king? Who decided that? It all just seems very unfair and unequal, and I, for one, am starting to question it.
Yeah, well, questioning the need for a king would have been extremely controversial, even among these sort of enlightened circles, but I imagine here we are depicting the rise of sort of Enlightenment thought, the philosophers in France. Of course, this went far beyond just France. there were entrenched feudal social hierarchies all throughout Europe, and people began questioning these hierarchies, right? It begins with the scientific revolution. People begin to question the way the world works. Eventually, this leads, primarily in the 18th century, to people questioning, now wait a minute, why are our societies set up like this? Why are our social hierarchies set up like this? Why are we running our governments like this? People are asking these questions. Some people are coming up with alternate solutions. Maybe you should run your monarchy a little more efficiently. Perhaps you should have a constitutional monarchy, put some limits on the monarch's power. The most radical among them may have advocated for a republic, but that was still a pretty radical position throughout the 18th century, right? A lot of your Enlightenment types were advocates of perhaps constitutional monarchy, maybe a form of enlightened despotism, where the monarch still has absolute power, but rules in accordance with sort of Enlightenment principles of good government. But essentially, people are questioning, why don't we do things a little differently?
Wow, that's very enlightened of you. And so began the Age of Enlightenment.
Right.
Great philosophical thinkers across France and beyond began to question whether this beautiful nation was really all that beautiful after all. Hey, Prince Louis, bad news. Your grandpa died of smallpox this morning, which means good news, you're now the king. So just to sum up, France is in severe financial debt, and the angry populace are beginning to question how necessary you are. But hey, I believe in you, champ. You got this. Maybe. Oh no! Prince Louis Capet became King Louis XVI in May 1774. He was a notoriously weak man, and he knew it. He barely had the wisdom to rule a nation, never mind one in crisis, and he was easily manipulated by those around him.
Yeah, the character of Louis will probably be a big part of this story. Of course, that's only so much of it. There's a whole lot more social, economic trends that went into this revolution, but given that you're the king, your character's a pretty important part of the puzzle, right? I talked about him when I talked about Nicholas in our videos on the Russian Revolution. These are men who, sort of, not on purpose, of course, cause a revolution, not because they're so incredibly stubborn, though they could be sometimes, but because they were weak and vacillating and didn't know what the right decision was. That's what characterizes someone like Louis XVI.
One of his first acts was to try to get revenge on the British by financing their American colonies' revolution. Hey, we're an independent nation now. That was real swell of you, Louis. Couldn't have done it without you. Glad I could help. So hey, about all that money we lent you, when can we get that back? Yep, you're a great guy. I'll never forget what you've done for us. Real glad I could help, friend, but about that money, gotta go now, chum. Best of luck to you. Oh, no. And now France was in even more debt.
Yeah, this sinks France even deeper into debt, right? France makes this decision, which, from the French financial perspective, may not have been a good one, to back the fledgling United States, the American revolutionaries. Now, as an American, I'm very grateful, but this did not help the French economy, right? They sink all this money in, and the Americans, when they end their revolution, they end up on relatively good terms with the Brits again. They sort of, in fact, go behind the scenes to sign a deal with the Brits, which the French don't like, because they're like, hey, we're your guys. And the Americans are like, yeah, oh well. And they also stop paying back the French. So, not a great situation for the French, right? They were already not in a fantastic financial spot. Now it's even worse.
France's poor, suffering under the strain of economic ruin, watched as the nobility continued to live as though nothing was wrong. In particular, they grew increasingly disdainful of the Queen, Marie Antoinette, as she continued to spend all of France's money on her own luxurious lifestyle and fashion. While the peasants were breaking their backs in the fields, she was walking around like, hey, my hair is a boat. I'm not making that up. Her hair really was a boat.
Yeah, Marie Antoinette sort of became a symbol of the excesses of the French aristocracy, right? She was accused of a lot of things that she probably didn't actually do. There were a lot of lurid stories about Marie Antoinette, but, like I said, mostly it's that she was held up as a symbol of the excess and greed and luxury of the aristocrats. So they saw her as more of that symbol than as an actual person, because I mean, she wasn't necessarily the most pleasant individual, and that's to put it lightly, but a lot of the stories about her were not true.
And her lavish spending earned her the nickname Madame Deficit. And speaking of the Queen, there was also a long-standing scandal around the fact that the king took a very long time to boink her, and the
Right.
working classes of Paris began ridiculing the royal couple with lewd pamphlets depicting the Queen as a court thought, and the king as a wuss, unable to fulfill his marital duty. Respect for the monarchy was at an all-time low, as France's finances were spiraling out of control, and the king and his aides really only had one solution to the crisis: tax the poor. Tax the poor. We could do a sexy calendar shoot. I mean, tax the poor.
Yeah, so there were a couple of efforts made to reverse France's financial downturn, right? So you can start off with Turgot, financial minister sort of prior to the American Revolution. Now, he's what we call a physiocrat, aka an economic liberal. What that means is he's pro-free market. He supports simplifying the tax system, putting one tax on all land, and he wants essentially free trade within France, because at this time, there were a lot of customs barriers within France. Government was still not incredibly centralized, and so one of his actions is to essentially implement free trade on grain. This is incredibly unpopular, right? Bad harvest, bread gets expensive, you have riots, right? So that doesn't really work for Turgot. He gets pushed out. You have a couple more of these financial ministers. Jacques Necker, he sort of goes for financial transparency, exposes the accounts of the monarchy and the French government, takes more and more loans. It doesn't really work for him. He gets pushed out. He gets brought back later. He doesn't really manage to fix the problem either. You know, you've got a couple of these financial ministers who try to do reforms, but either they become so unpopular, like Turgot, in the eyes of the public that they get pushed out, or they try to reform a little too much, and the French aristocracy doesn't like that, and so they get pushed out. They say, well, what if we were to tax, I don't know, the aristocracy? No, that's not going to go, right? So there are some efforts from the French government to, like I said, reverse France's financial downturn, but in the end, they don't work. They fail. They are not accepted either by the public, the king, or the aristocracy, and so that downturn essentially continues.
And so it was. The poor, who were already struggling to make ends meet, found themselves being taxed from every direction. Hey, I'm the royal tax collector. Looks like you've yet to pay your income tax, head tax. By the way, how many windows you got in that house of yours? 3? Oof, yep. There's gonna be a tax for that. Hey, your local priest here. Have you paid your church tithe yet? Well, at least this one is going to the good work of God. Sure. God. I think.
Yeah, well, this is worth pointing out that, you know, the French Catholic Church owned a lot of land throughout the country, right? So a lot of land was owned by the Catholic Church. They ran a lot of it. They made a profit off a lot of that land. So a massive chunk of the farmland in France was owned by the church. And of course, at this point, a lot of wealth still came from agriculture. This is going to become a problem as we get further into the revolution. But you also have all these different government taxes to pay. And like I said, government was not incredibly centralized at this time. And so depending on where you were, you would have pretty high variety in what the taxes were, depending on where you lived. But it was pretty tough on the peasantry, right? You had a land tax on the third estate. You had the gabelle, which is a salt tax, right? Salt was extremely important for food, for example, making sure your food would last, right? So salt was something that was used very frequently by the peasantry. And a lot of these taxes were levied exclusively on the third estate. If you were the first or second, right, clergy or aristocrat, you were not paying these taxes, which a lot of people felt was incredibly unfair.
This year, God wants me to buy a new swimming pool. Hey, private tax collector here. Oh, and I brought some goons with me. Just a few quick questions. How much salt did you buy this year?
Right.
About 7 kilos, I think? Yep. Okay, there's gonna be a tax for that. Oh, what's that over there? And that's extra salt I held over from last year, so I wouldn't have to buy as much this year. Oh, yep, there's a tax for that. And what are you doing with all this salt? Well, obviously cooking. On the table. Yep. And preserving fish and meat.
Right.
Oh no. Yep. And there's a tax for that. Hey, How old is he? He's 9. And so he's purchased his required amount of salt for this year, right? What? No, he's 9.
Huh.
Uh-oh. Sorry, little Timmy. Looks like I'm gonna have to tax you for that. Yep. Salty.
Yeah, you can see why a lot of people were pretty upset with the system, right? This is the late 1700s, it's the era of the Enlightenment and liberalism and such, but this is still a rather feudal system, right? So a lot of people did want reform to the system. Even a lot of those aristocrats, right? Even some of those ministers we were talking about. It just so happens the king and his inner circle were not willing to do that, and a lot of your more powerful aristocrats were also not willing to give up any of their wealth or their land for reform, right? They wanted to keep everything for themselves. So essentially, people wanted reform, but often those in positions of ultimate power, absolute power, which was really the king and whoever was around the king who could influence him, they sort of put a kibosh on a lot of this, at least radical reform. And as we talked about, some of the more moderate reform, it didn't really end up working out in the end.
There's going to be a tax for that. And that's not all. A huge portion of the peasants' harvest had to be given up. And there was also the labor tax, where peasants were required to work a certain number of days for
Right.
their local lord
When I say feudal, this is exactly what I mean.
without pay. Obviously, people weren't too happy with these taxation policies, and the aggressive nature of these private tax farmers sometimes even escalated to violence. In particular, though, the people really hated how inconsistent the
Right.
taxation rules were
Right.
across the nation, and also the fact that the first 2 estates often had to pay very little, if any tax at all.
Yep.
And so, the anger continued to grow. France had a population that was just about ready to explode. What could push them over the edge? How about a touch of natural disaster? A series of harsh summers and winters left the peasants' harvests in ruin, meaning they had no food or money, and the cost of bread skyrocketed. Of course, the upper classes had massive stocks of grain and wheat, so
See, this is why environmental history is very, very important. I mean, more than just this, of course, it's important for a lot of reasons, but, the natural environment has made a big impact throughout history. In fact, sometimes an absolutely earth-shattering impact, both literally and figuratively. Oftentimes, when you look at these revolutionary events, whether we're talking about the French Revolution here, or the revolutions of 1848, or other revolutionary periods, you can tie that back to some sort of natural disaster or environmental cause, like one or several bad harvests, right? Rising grain and bread prices that often leads to dissatisfaction, perhaps rebellion, perhaps even revolution.
of bread skyrocketed. Of course, the upper classes had massive stocks of grain and wheat, so they were virtually untouched by this new crisis. But now the poor really were starving, and they began to riot. Women took to the streets, bakeries were raided, and bakers suspected of keeping bread for themselves were sometimes even hanged. Wow, this is really getting out of control. Your Majesty.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously at this moment, it was not clear that France was about to fall into one of the greatest revolutions of all time. However, it was clear that people were upset. There was violence in the streets, there was action being taken by the peasantry. Now, to be fair, this was not the most uncommon type of thing, right? We have bread riots throughout history, throughout French history. So, it wasn't like incredibly rare, but everyone could see, okay, the peasants are angry, they're hungry. We're not in a good situation, though they didn't know quite how monumental the change would be.
We need some decisive action. You need to step up and lead us. What will you do? Okay, I've got this. I know. I'll summon the Estates General, and they'll decide what to do. You really are a fat, ill-bred boy. The Estates General was the closest thing France had to a government.
Right, and before we get to the Estates General, I'll point out that in 1789, so 2 years before the Estates General is summoned, Louis calls together the Assembly of Notables, which is essentially a assembly of nobility, right? Of aristocrats. It's sort of your aristocratic version of your Estates General here, and he hopes initially to push through financial reforms with them, right? His idea is that, well, we'll get the nobles together, and they'll do exactly what I tell them. Well, what happens is he gets the nobles together, and they do not do exactly what he tells them. Louis' minister Calonne, another one of these ministers who try to fix things and fail. He's sort of running the show, and the assembly is in absolute opposition. They demand financial transparency from the king, which he does not want to give. They do not agree to his financial reforms, right? So that does not work for old Louis. So he says, all right, let's call the Estates General. Maybe they'll help me out.
Apart from the king, it was a purely advisory body and was rarely summoned. In fact, it hadn't been summoned for 175 years prior to this. But with France in a severe crisis, the king felt the time was right to call on the government to help. The Estates General was made up of representatives from the three estates, that is, the clergy, the nobility, and everybody else. Okay, thanks for coming, everyone. The first order of business is regarding the clergy and nobility. You all get brand new Porsches. You get a Porsche, and you get a Porsche, and you get a Porsche. Everybody gets a Porsche. And now into the second order of business. France is completely out of money.
Ooh.
Like, it's never been this bad before.
Yeah.
Anyone got any ideas?
Yeah, it's like it's been bad for a while, right? Especially following the 7 Years' War. France sank a lot of money into that. In fact, the 7 Years' War causes a lot of issues in many different countries who participated, right? They sink a lot of money into it, and they need to find ways to pay it off. It's not surprising that, a couple decades, years after the 7 Years' War ends, you start seeing rebellions and revolutions around the world, right? I mean, you can tie the American Revolution to the actions of the British government taken following the end of the 7 Years' War to try and recoup some of the costs. Anyway, we're talking about France. 7 Years' War really sinks them financially. They continue. Things are not really getting better. They're kind of stagnant. Then they decide to invest in the American Revolution. That sinks them even further. And then they don't really get paid back by the Americans, and so they're really at a low.
How about we all get Lamborghinis next time? The king decided that in order to make a decision, they had to come up with a voting system. Okay, the clergy. You have a population of 130,000, so you'll get one vote. The nobility. You have a population of 350,000, so you'll also get one vote. And the third estate. You have a population of 27 million people and make up 98% of the population. Very impressive. You'll get one vote.
Ooh.
The third estate were obviously pretty unhappy with this.
Yeah, so there was a big debate leading up to the Estates General about how they would distribute the votes. A lot of people were saying, hey, it's a new era. We heard how long it had been since the Estates General had been called. We're in a new era. We have this massive third estate. We're not just peasants anymore. We've got lawyers and bureaucrats and, businessmen, and some of us are pretty wealthy, right? This is when the third estate starts to become a problem, when some of them actually gain some real power. And they're saying, we want to be fairly represented. And then this happens. Now, I'll show us a document that was published at that time to sort of give you an idea of the conflict that was happening here. So this is a pamphlet called What is the Third Estate by the Abbé Sieyès, published in early 1789 before the Estates General met, while this debate was going on about how it should be called, how representation should work, right? So this gives you an idea of sort of the thought of that time, right? This was a very popular pamphlet. So it starts off like this. The plan of this book is fairly simple. We must ask ourselves 3 questions. What is the third estate? Everything. What has it been until now? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something. Right? So that's how we begin. I'll point out a couple other passages in here. Sieyès, in the first chapter of this, he asks us, what does a nation require to survive and prosper? It needs private activities and public services, which he then breaks down into several categories. If you want to read the whole thing, I'll link it down below. He basically says, all these activities support society. Who performs them? The third estate. Right? So the third estate performs all of these private and public services which support society. Right? So the third estate basically does everything. They are the nation. I'll note, by the way, that Abbé Sieyès, as you can probably tell from his title, he was a clergyman. So he was technically a member of the first estate. But there were some members of the first and second estates who were more or less sympathetic with the plight of the third estate. That could often be maybe parish priests who were not so high and mighty as the clergymen who led the church, perhaps those who are a little more radical in their ideas. Same thing for the nobility, right? There were some liberals among the nobility. There were some nobles who had only recently become nobles by purchasing their position. These we call nobles of the robe, those who were new to the class, versus nobles of the sword, those who had been granted to their aristocracy, centuries, generations prior for service to the king, right? So it wasn't like it was entirely third estate versus everybody else. There were those sympathetic among the other two estates. So in Chapter 2, CS covers how the third estate has essentially been repressed by the first two estates, and that they need to assert themselves. Then we get to Chapter 3, right? What does the third estate want to be? Something. And this directly relates to the estates general. So what exactly does the third estate want? That the representatives of the third estate be chosen solely from among citizens who really belong to the third estate. Right? They don't want to be represented by aristocrats claiming to represent them. They want to be represented by true third estaters. And here he actually talks about some of those, third estate individuals, some of those bourgeois lawyers who have attained nobility by essentially buying them. He says, the third estate does not want those types of individuals representing them. They want people who are truly of the third estate. Secondly, we have the second claim of the third estate, that his deputies be equal in number to those of the two privileged orders. Right? They want representatives equal to those of the other two orders combined, right? Which seems only fair. And then point 3, which is perhaps the most important point here, is they want the Estates General to vote not by orders, but by heads, meaning they don't want the system that we just saw, where the first estate has one vote, the second estate has one vote, the third estate has one vote. What Sieyès is suggesting is that they vote by representative, right? By each individual. And that would obviously give the third estate a massive advantage, right? So these are some of the points that Sieyès puts together. He calls for other things in this pamphlet, like more equal burden of taxation, for example. That was a big one. But this is just a view into the thought of that time, that particular time. Right now, remember, Abbé Sieyès is one individual. He may not represent everybody, and he was a clergyman himself, but this was a very popular pamphlet, especially among those who were from the Third Estate, but from sort of a higher social background, those who were lawyers or bureaucrats or involved in some way in politics. They really got on board with this. This sort of represented a pretty general perspective that the Third Estate wanted to assert itself. It wanted more representation, and that is not what it got. So we can get back to the oversimplified video now.
The Third Estate were obviously pretty unhappy with this system because they kept on finding that this would happen. We propose to raise taxes on the Third Estate. All in favor? All opposed? 2-1. Taxes will be raised on the Third Estate.
Right.
We propose a motion that says the first two estates are a bunch of poo-poo heads. All in favor? All opposed? 2-1. It's official. We are not poo-poo heads.
So you could see in practice here why, people like Abbé Sieyès and a lot of those interested in fair proceedings were not satisfied with how things went down.
Third Estate realized that any attempt at reform would be outvoted by the two upper estates, and they thought that was kind of lame. So they decided that since they were 98% of the population, they could go off to form their own government, make their own laws, and take over the running of the country. And so, the National Assembly was born.
Yeah, this is how you see the creation of the National Assembly. The Third Estate essentially removes itself from the Estates General and says, fine, we'll make an assembly of our own. And we saw in that pamphlet by Sieyès, he says, the Third Estate are everything, they are the nation. And so if that's the case, then why can't they represent the nation on their own?
The Third Estate was now in control, and there was nothing the king could do to stop. Ha! I've locked you all out of your building. What are you going to do about it? We'll probably go find a different building that isn't locked. Oh, no. The National Assembly did find another unlocked
Yeah, the king, he really tried to thwart him on that one, but not quite.
building. Just down the road, an indoor tennis court. Where on the 20th of June, 1789, they all took the tennis court oath, pledging to continue meeting until the king finally gave in to their demands for more equality and
And I'll point out, I sort of said this prior, but this was primarily a meeting of the Third Estate. However, there were sympathetic members of the First and Second Estates who joined up, right? Who said, fine, we also quit the Estates General. We're going to join up with the Third Estate, right? And like I said, while we were looking at that CS pamphlet, it was oftentimes your more radical liberals among the bunch, those who sort of thought a little differently. Among your priests, maybe some of your priests who were a little closer to the ground, closer to the people. Among your nobles, some of your liberals, maybe some of those who were a little newer to nobility who had bought their way in, right? Some of those guys join up with the Third Estate in their efforts here.
Economic reform. This new National Assembly included many of the most educated members of the Third Estate, including two young lawyers by the names of Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton. Some members of the first two estates even joined their cause.
Right.
Some of these men formed a radical new political party called the Jacobin Club and quickly became leading figures. While many members of the Third Estate simply wanted more equality, a growing number in this Jacobin faction would begin calling for something even crazier, the removal of the king entirely. And this is where fear began to take hold.
Yes, though I will say, we need to remember that we look at an event like the French Revolution, it sort of gets squeezed down. But this was an event that happened over time, over years. And so, you sort of see continued radicalization as the revolution continues. So at this point, someone suggesting that they should get rid of the king was still an extremely radical proposition. When we talk about all these guys getting together for the National Assembly, we are still talking about more sort of moderate liberal types, right? Those who wanted a constitutional monarchy, but even that, I mean, a lot of these guys were just people who wanted fairer representation for the Third Estate, right? That's what started this all. And so those who were calling for a republic at this moment, that is extremely, extremely radical. Now, as we go, right, the Overton window shifts, and that becomes more and more accepted. But in 1789, that's not really what's going on.
With such a volatile situation developing, everyone was afraid of something. The king feared his position was under threat, and he called in the military to take position around Paris. The Third Estate heard rumor of the gathering military force, and they feared the king was planning to round them up and arrest them. Maybe he'd even execute them. It also didn't help that the king had just dismissed France's popular finance minister, who had been trying to make reforms himself. It seemed the king was done negotiating.
Yeah, I talked about Necker a little earlier, right? So we have Turgot, Calonne, Necker. Now, Necker actually serves twice, right? Once a little earlier, he's the one who sort of publishes the accounts of the monarchy and the government, sort of transparency that a lot of people in high places don't like. Necker, he sort of comes back, I believe 1788 to 89, sort of attempts to make some reforms. Ultimately, Necker is not very successful, right? He's brought again, once again, a little later. He doesn't really succeed anything. He's sort of seen as this financial wonder boy. He's very popular among sort of the reading public of France. I think because he wants this transparency, and a lot of the sort of conservative aristocrats at the top don't really like him. Necker doesn't really manage to accomplish much, but he gets fired by old King Louis, and the people don't like that, right? So that's one of the things that really sets things off right here.
Fear, left unchecked, often boils over into anger, and anger detonates with violence. The angry people of Paris, after centuries of cruel inequality, harsh oppression, even starvation, fearful of having their new movement for reform demolished so soon, decided that it was now or never to take action. Screw reform. They decided they'd do one better. How about revolution? The people of Paris, believing the French military was preparing to attack, decided they should arm themselves. The National Assembly...
But it is still revolution for the sake of reform. And I'm going to talk about right here the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen before we get to the actual action in the streets, because this is the document that really defines the revolutionary principles and goals of the French Revolution. So let me pull this up. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen here, now it was going through drafts before the sort of action in the streets really kicked off with the Bastille. See, ultimately it was published a little bit later, worked on initially a lot by Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, and then especially in later stages by Abbé Sieyès once again. So this was sort of seen as the foundational document of the French Revolution, though, I think a lot of these principles were in some ways taken up or abandoned depending on the era of the revolution. You can debate all of that, but this was and remains today an extremely important document. I'll read to you here some of these principles that are laid out. So we've got men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on common utility. Right, so that at the end there is obviously a jab at the system of unjust aristocracy. We have the purpose of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. You'll notice there's some pretty clear similarities to the Declaration of Independence, right? Remember, Thomas Jefferson was one of the main guys who worked on and edited this, even though he maybe shouldn't have been since he was minister to France at that time. It would have seen as a little inappropriate to have gotten himself this involved, but he did, right? So you'll see a lot of influence from him in that document. You've got the law as the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to take part, in person or by their representatives, in its formation. It must be the same for everyone, whether it protects or penalizes. All citizens being equal in its eyes are equally admissible to all public dignities, offices, and employments according to their ability and with no other distinction than that of their virtues and talents. So we've got essentially equality under the law, meritocracy, right? A lot of these very Enlightenment era ideas. Every man being presumed innocent until judged guilty, right? Innocent until judged guilty. That's another classic. The freedom both of opinion and religion. No one should be disturbed for his opinions, even in religion, provided that their manifestation does not trouble public order as established by the law, right? Some very classic Enlightenment ideas like we saw expressed in the American Revolution. Every citizen may therefore speak, write, and print freely if he accepts his own responsibility for any abuse of this liberty in the cases set by the law, right? So sort of an extension of our previous point. Here's a big one. For maintenance of public authority and for expenses of administration, common taxation is indispensable. It should be apportioned equally among all the citizens according to their capacity to pay, right? So it should not be distributed depending on whether you're an aristocrat, which means you don't pay any taxes. It should be distributed equally according to your capacity to pay, right? So that's the taxation was a big point we saw earlier in the video. The peasantry in particular, but the third estate was tired of taking on the vast majority of the burden of taxation. And we end off here, property being an inviolable and sacred right. No one may be deprived of it except when public necessity, certified by law, obviously requires it, and on the condition of a just compensation in advance. They've got property rights, right? Something very popular among your bourgeois middle classes, sort of a step forward from the feudal era. Right, so we can see here, these are the sort of principles of that revolution. These are often seen as sort of the principles of 1789, before the revolution sort of kept moving past them. You might have a different opinion on that. That sort of is up to individual interpretation. But regardless, this was an extremely important document of the French Revolution, probably the most important document of the French Revolution, has been very important even beyond the French Revolution. We can see some of the principles laid out here. All right, let's jump back into the video.
Assembly announced the creation of a bourgeois militia, the National Guard, and immediately many troops from the French military defected over to the revolutionary side.
Headed by one Marquis de Lafayette, right? So, Lafayette served in the American Revolution. He was quite known for his liberal principles. Not too much of a shock that he would join up with the revolutionaries, but of course, Marquis de Lafayette, he was a member of the Second Estate. He was an aristocrat. So he's sort of perhaps the poster child of these types of liberal aristocrats who joined up in the early days of the revolution and then became a little dissatisfied with the direction of the revolution as it continued, Lafayette sort of represents that group of individuals.
In the early hours of July 14th, 1789, a large crowd stormed and raided the Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital where they were able to secure a large number of rifles. The bad news was they weren't able to find any gunpowder for their new weapons. The good news was they knew exactly where to get some. A prison fortress and a symbol of royal tyranny towering over Paris, the Bastille.
Yeah, I mean, this was good for two reasons, right? They wanted to get some damn gunpowder, and also this was a symbol of tyranny. One of the points in the Declaration of the Rights of Man that we didn't cover explicitly was essentially no more arbitrary arrest and imprisonment, right? Because that's something that the king was doing, right? You could be pretty arbitrarily arrested if the king wanted you to be, right? Arrested for a whole variety of crimes and not crimes at all, right? And you'd be locked up, right? So this was seen as Oversimplified put it, quite a symbol of royal tyranny.
Mid-morning, the crowd gathered around the Bastille and demanded that the man in charge, Governor Delaunay, surrender the prison and hand over the gunpowder. Obviously, Governor Delaunay was like, no way. So he stalled for time by inviting a few members of the crowd in for negotiations. The crowd, still waiting outside, quickly became impatient, and before long, they stormed the fortress, taking on the French troops inside. Your Majesty, we've received word that the people have surrounded the Bastille. Governor Delaunay will hold them off. No need to worry.
Sure.
Actually, Your Majesty, it appears the crowd is now headed away from the Bastille. You see? What did I tell you? Clearly, Governor Delaunay has defeated them and has them on the run. No need to worry. Your Majesty, isn't that Governor Delaunay's head on a pike? Well, clearly, Governor Delaunay has taken on the form of a bodiless pike-head deity, and the people are so enamored with him, they're parading him around the city. No need to worry at all. When the National Assembly heard about the violence that had taken place, they had two options. Either one, they denounce it and try to carry on the revolution using peaceful means, or two, they say, damn, you stuck his head on a pike? That's pretty hardcore. And we love it. Incidentally, they went with option number 2.
Yeah, I think, one, you'll be hard-pressed to look for a revolution that is in its entirety, or even mostly peaceful. I think the idea among a lot of these sort of liberal revolutionary types, or they're becoming revolutionary types, was that, they may not have been a fan of mob violence. In fact, it sort of frightened a lot of them. But they saw that mob violence was erupting in the streets. I will say, remember, a lot of these are not necessarily Democrats, and by that I mean believers in democracy. A lot of them, they may want a constitutional monarchy. A lot of them only want representation for wealthy, land-owning men. Just they don't want those men to have to be aristocrats. So a lot of these guys are pretty elitist. They see a lot of the people as sort of the unwashed masses, and they're afraid of them. Not all of them. Some of these guys reveled in sort of mob violence. However, sort of the thought, even among your more moderate types, was, well, mob violence is running rampant through the streets. We can either sort of let it run free, because if we tell them to stop, they ain't gonna listen, or we can try and direct it in a productive direction, right? So that's sort of what they go for. And these things sort of evolve throughout the revolution, right? Like I said, you get more radicals in power, the Overton window shifts, you get more people who are open Republicans, even the occasional sort of more democratic type. But among this crowd, that is still not super common.
Some historians believe this reaction paved the way for the utter violence and bloodshed that would become the legacy of the French Revolution. This widespread acceptance of violence during the Revolution is also largely credited to the writings of a certain Jean-Paul Marat, a man of science with a
I don't know if I'd say largely credited. Marat definitely played a role in encouraging the radicalism of the revolution, but, a lot of people played a role in mobilizing, encouraging, and directing the violence of the revolution, though Marat is an important figure, of course.
Horrible skin condition that kept him confined to a bathtub.
Yep.
He began writing a radical newspaper he affectionately named The Friend of the People. Citizens of France, be very afraid. Given the chance, the king and the nobility won't hesitate to massacre us all. The solution is simple. Execute them. Kill every last one of them. Cut off 1,000 heads, and if that's not enough, cut off 1,000 more. Oh, hey, Mr. Squeaky. What are you doing down there?
Marat was definitely an influential voice of the early to mid-ish revolution. He's sort of a journalist, largely expressed through his writing. He does, in many ways, influence the course of events.
You're so cute.
Like I said,
Oh, I love you
radical.
too, Mr. Squeaky.
Very radical.
Mwah. Now, where was I? Oh, yeah. Kill them all. It became one of the most popular publications in Paris during the revolution and succeeded in spreading ever-increasing fear and anger among the people.
Though, once again, sort of as we get into the revolution, those of Marat's ilk, of his political persuasion, will begin to gain more and more power.
In August, leaders of the National Assembly, with help from a certain Thomas Jefferson,
Yeah.
adopted the Declaration
Oh,
of the
there
Rights
you
of
go.
Man and of the Citizen, an incredible document that guaranteed liberty
Whoops.
and equal rights to
Should have let him get to it. But I wanted to illustrate that it was already in development through this period before the March on the Bastille, right? It wasn't adopted until a little bit later, but they had been writing it.
all men. And when I say men, I mean men. Despite
Well,
its
yeah.
glaring shortcomings in gender equality, the massively influential declaration would go on to inspire the struggle for liberty and equality across the planet for centuries. However, back in France, the vast majority of the people weren't really so concerned with enlightened ideas of equality as much as they were concerned with the fact that they were still starving. Bread was still expensive as hell and hard to come by. The people felt that one reason nothing had been done yet about the crisis was because the king simply couldn't see the problem. He lived in Versailles, a full 20 kilometers southwest of Paris.
And sort of on the issue of why were the people motivated to get out there in the streets, this is why a lot of these sort of liberal middle class types, they're like, well, we should direct the people in a direction we so desire. It doesn't work out for all of them, to be clear, but a lot of the people are most concerned about getting food and less with revolutionary principles and ideas. Though I will say, as the revolution continues, with the constant revolutionary sloganeering, the people of France do become very familiar with revolutionary ideas and slogans, and they do become, somewhat inspiring to a lot of people. You see this especially in the military affairs of the French Republic eventually. These are ideas that did become important to people. But what we're talking about in this moment is people who are angry, upset, they feel they've been done dirty, and most importantly, they're hungry. And they still have this idea that the king, the king's been this revered figure throughout all of their lives. We are sort of moving past the era of, sort of divine selection, but people still believe the king in some way is sort of connected to God. He is this sort of quasi-religious political figure at the top of the government. There was a lot of mockery and scandal, right? But a lot of people still thought, if Louis could just see what was going on, he'd know what to do, right? The only reason he's acting like this is because he doesn't know what's happening. It's the classic, well, it's not the king, it's his ministers, right? So they think if we can bring Louis back, he'll be a great leader, right? He can get us exactly what we want.
And as a result, lived in comfort, separated from his dirty, stinking subjects. On October 5th, a crowd of women, 7,000 strong, decided they'd do something unprecedented. They decided they'd remove that separation and confront the king directly. The women marched all the way to the king's palace in Versailles. Along the way, the crowd continued to grow into the tens of thousands. And when they arrived, they demanded an audience.
Once again, I mentioned this with the Russian Revolution, where we saw a lot of that revolutionary action got started with the Women's March. Well, we see the same thing here. It essentially gets started as a Women's March to Versailles that really kicks... things were already going, but this is a big moment in the early French Revolution.
With the king. What are those things outside the palace?
Yep.
They're poor people, your majesty. That's poor people? They say they're hungry. Hungry? Then let them eat cake. Wow. See, this is the exact BS that led to this whole mess in the first place. You're so out of touch. They're writhing around in the filth,
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about this particular quote. I don't think it ever happened, the let them eat cake moment. I really don't know the veracity of it. There's some people who have alternate explanations, but I'm pretty sure it just didn't happen, right? This is one of those stories that, it seems to so perfectly sum up the issue with the French aristocracy and I think it perfectly sums it up because it's not true. Things aren't usually wrapped up that nicely in real history.
Breaking their back to barely scrape by, and they come to you demanding just the basic ability to feed themselves, and you think a slice of cake will sort them out? Well, then let them eat Taco Bell Crunchwrap Supreme.
Hmm.
Wow. They're not that desperate. Members of the crowd actually managed to break into the palace with the intention of killing the queen, who narrowly escaped through a secret passage in her bedroom. The enraged mob killed several members of the royal guard and raised their heads on pikes, which, if you haven't noticed yet, is something they were quite fond of doing.
Yep.
The king had no choice but to come out and talk to the crowd. He agreed to accept his new position, sharing power with the revolutionary government, and to return to Paris with the crowd, removing the separation between king and subject.
Once again, and to be fair, I'm not saying Louis should have done anything different in this moment, but remember, Louis is not the most, assertive leader of all time. He's quite vacillating. He's more reactive, right? He lets things happen and he reacts to them. It says me. No, that's not what I mean by reacts, right? He doesn't really take the initiative. He's sort of like, all right, I'll come back to Paris. I'll do what you want, And, his conservative advisors talk to him. He's like, you're right, I should end this all. And then some liberals talk to him, and he's like, okay, I could be a constitutional monarch. He's not really made for this kind of thing. He probably, in a different era of French history, could have been a sort of middling to decent king. Like, yeah, he's all right, he's fine. But in this situation, he's bad. He's not the guy you want.
King Louis had a problem with people constantly raiding his palace. But one thing he didn't have a problem with was people raiding his computer, because he used NordVPN. If, like me, you don't like hackers stealing your data, password,
there we go.
Link below, nordvpn.com/oversimplified.
So I'll leave Oversimplified's video linked down below. You can go and show him some support, leave him a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank him for making these fantastic videos. I know this one is years old at this point. But yeah, an interesting video. I always like to talk about the French Revolution, as you could probably tell. And so this is part 1 of 2. Once again, if you're watching part 1 and you'd like to see part 2 early, well, first of all, it's linked at the top of the description and in the comments section. But also, to see it, you'll need to become a member of the YouTube channel. And you can do that by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button. Become a channel member, access to exclusive content, and to see oversimplified videos like this early. So, with that, hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, channel member, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.